Hello, my name is Paul, and I'm making this video about some ideas and concepts that can be useful for people who are trying to make a protection from COVID-19. Very quickly, I have a background in industrial design, and during my education, I was very interested in appropriate technology. And I would encourage you to go to www.practicalaction.org or Google the Schumacher Institute or E.F. Schumacher to find out more. It's basically about concepts in design as if and economics as if people matter. And some of the issues that and inefficiencies in production are being faced with the COVID-19 crisis. Production sometimes takes a lot of money. We need government money, millions and billions, to pay 3M to retool an entire assembly line to create massive amounts of unlimited supply of disposable masks, which is fine in many cases, but now that we have to spend all this money to it's very expensive, it takes time. Meanwhile, people are in need of supplies and those and shortages. So sometimes the really big solution is too big, and yet a simple rag is not enough. We need to find a way that we can have means of production for ourselves and for our resources that's somewhere in between to fill in that gap. And it's especially important for people who don't have access to factory industrial development. So that's kind of what I'm trying to share in this video. It's not your typical DIY video of this is how to make the mask. It's just that these are ideas and concepts and research that if you bear them in mind in making your own designs and fabrications, that can lead to a very effective solution. And my goal is to get as close to the 3M quality as we can intuitively make sense of. So now, to begin with on the research, I was fortunate enough to have an aunt who's a PhD in medical microbiology. And in her career, she worked for the Army and the Navy, developing vaccines for diseases that were found in Vietnam, the Pacific Rim, and places around the world. She's worked on AIDS. She's worked on germ warfare. And she was able to look up some things about COVID-19 for herself and everybody else. And so these are what we call design parameters. What are our goals? Well, one is that to date, they haven't been able to induce a skin infection directly in to cause COVID-19, to cause the outbreak. So our main concern is breathing it in. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't wipe that down. I'll surfaces down. I'll get to that later. But our main concern is breathing something in. Okay, so and then viruses tend to be very, very small, between like 1 and 5 microns. Anthrax can get down to 1 micron. It's very, very small. While dust is about 10 or 20 microns, and a bacteria might be 10 microns. So if I had COVID-19 and I'm giving off the virus in my breathing, it would typically travel airborne for about 10 feet, and then it will begin to fall to the ground, and by 15 feet it will hit the ground. So the protocols that people who are working directly with this virus in labs and things like my aunt, they would typically say if there was an accident, they get 20 feet away. 20 feet away if there's no other protection. So that's actually the safe distance. Now that's assuming the person isn't coughing, sneezing, a breeze to carry it. So 20 feet is really your safe distance and you should be getting out of there fast if you're near somebody who is infected and you have no other protections. However, viruses can fall on particles of dust, which tend to collect on surfaces. And particles of dust can become airborne again. So for basic safety, I'm going to keep distance. I'm going to have protective clothes. I'm looking for people who are symptomatic. I'm working with my neighbors to keep ourselves safe. We're wiping down surfaces with disinfectant to pick up dust and to kill any viruses that are on the surfaces so they don't become airborne. We're doing all of those things, and we need to do those as a community to prevent those airborne infections. We basically want protection from dust. Unless, you're a medical personnel, you need that anthrax level screen. But for the most part, to keep ourselves safe and live our lives, we want something that is about a 10 micron dust mask. Now, I have a couple of masks here, and we can to compare the efficacy of filtration. This is a simple 2-ply cotton mask, kind of like you could just sew up at home. Now, I can breathe through it, just through the material, and now I'm going to compare it to, this is a very low-end 3M mask that's used in woodworking. So if you were going to be sawing wood and there's sawdust in the air, this would be a very good mask to have. It's not the best mask they make, but it's very good for dust protection. And if I compare how much filtration, this is pretty close. This is a little bit better. I would say it's about 25 or 30% more than 2 plies of this. This is a little bit better of a mask, and I don't even know if they make these regularly. This was specifically for mold spores, which are a little bit larger than the viruses and bacteria, but they're smaller than bacteria. It has but only a single coat on the inside. And here's the coveted N95 3M mask that has a protection for the 3 micron level, supposedly. At least I believe that's, I have to double check. I think it's to 3 microns screen. This is something that if somebody is a doctor or a nurse and they're working directly with somebody one-on-one, that you would want. And this has the same material, but it's not as thick. And when I go breathe just through the material, because these are some valves to assist breathing, it's roughly 50% more than this. And this is about twice this. So if I had 2 of these masks, that's about how much resistance I'm getting from breathing. So I'm trying to equate an intuitive understanding of how much filtration I'm breathing to a micron level. Now, that's not necessarily what what you're going to do in a manufacturing kind of situation, but in terms of making masks for yourself, for your neighbors, we can get a pretty good intuitive understanding about how much filtration we're getting. And again, we're not trying to make something for a doctor or a nurse or to work directly with a sick person. We're trying to basically keep ourselves reasonably safe with what we can produce. And now, one of the things that I looked to, and it's a concept that has been used in the history of devices that filter out dangerous particles. I looked to the Middle Ages when the Black Death hit. Doctors made these leather masks that had these long beak-like structures, and the doctors, they believed that the Black Death was caused because the orbit of the planets changed, and it caused the air to go bad, because people with Black Death tended to have a very bad smell from the boils. And so they they thought flowers are good air, right? Bad air, good air. So they had bouquets of flowers that they put in these big long cones right onto the nose like that. And it clearly did not stop the Black Death for the reasons they thought, but it was effective. Doctors were making house calls all the time, and and what happened was, you can see that there's a third dimension to the filter. The germs would come through the nose and would go fall on the organic material of the flowers that were jammed into that cone, and it would fall upon that. There was an amount of surface area that was greater than the volume, or the ratio of surface area to the volume that they were breathing in. This was very important for the filtration. So this clearly wasn't going to make a filter, a bouquet of flowers of a filter for, down to these micron levels in a single sheet, but it did filter out bacterium, which is about 10 microns, which is about the size of a dust particle that you might find, or could be. Now, you can compare, like, this would filter out a virus and actually it's not inevitable. The viruses will penetrate over time, so it's not like guaranteed and forever. But you can wear this for a long time, a very thin material, and you can see that it would be much more efficient of a material than something like a big, huge cone, right? But if you have to spend $1 billion to retool an assembly line and make massive productions and ship it all around the world and wait for the shipments to come, efficiency of material doesn't necessarily mean efficiency of human need. And, economics as if people matter, because we do. And so sometimes there are other efficiencies that we want to look for. Now, I kind of took that same idea and I took this basic cloth. It's just cheesecloth. This was just, and because this is something you might find or something similar in wherever you're at. Roll this up, and if there was dust on the top and I was breathing through it, how long would it take for the dust to get all the way to my nose? I think that would take quite a bit. And yes, viruses would fall and they would eventually migrate, but it would give me quite a bit of time before the viruses and the dust would get through all of that. Again, not as efficient of a material as 3M makes, but readily available and can give me a good sense of how much filtration. This is not quite as much breathing through this directly, but this is just for a demonstration. I'll take a paper cup, put some holes in it, jam that in. This seems a little bit more filtration with the holes, but the material itself, it feels like trying to breathe through all of this is about the same as trying to breathe through one of these. So, I have a pretty good idea that this might be able to filter out much more than where our target is of just simple dust particles I would encounter walking around or walking into a room. So anyway, I'm not going to give the DIY on how to make a big cone and put it around your head and things like that. I've seen amazing craftsmanship from craftsmen all around the world with materials and methods of skill. They're just extraordinary. I've seen crafts from Native American reservations that just blow me away. So I have no doubt that that people know better than I on how to make a mask if they wanted to use this concept. But the idea is that a mask does not have to be just a simple cloth across your face. You can think in 3 dimensions. And 3M actually uses that concept in many of their high-end respirator masks. Now, this is a respirator that I use to fabricate fiberglass. It makes a lot of toxic fumes and very small particles that are very dangerous. Once they're in your body, they never come out, really, and they just chew things up. Well, if we take one of these cartridges out, well, here, it's easier if I just pop the top off, I think. This is the chemical part, and I'm not going to address that in this video. But here's the filtration for the particles that we're interested in, and you can see it's much thicker than the N95. It seems to have the same kind of antiviral kind of level in there, and they just pop it up. They're making a 3-dimension on it. You're supposed to have 2 or 3 of these depending on what you're going for. So the idea that we can layer into a 3-dimension is something that we have to think about. We can find materials that are maybe not as efficient as the 3M, but if we make them thicker and yet comfortable, we can approach that level of filtration. Now, and so a very simple way, if I could take this big wad of cheesecloth and put it into this mask, and it's much more comfortable to breathe. Now, of course, I'm not as, breathing through all that I'm breathing through that much. But still, it would take quite a while for a dirt or particles and a virus to get all the way through. So it buys me some time. And it's slightly more effort to breathe through this wad of cheesecloth with 2-ply of cotton than this. Again, not efficient in material, but it might have a similar level of filtration just based on what the breathing is. And it's also important to realize that a mask needs to be comfortable, to be worn for a long time. Otherwise you're going to take it off in a dangerous spot, or you're not going to be able to function like you need to. This simple homemade mask is kind of okay, but when I put it around here, there's a lot of seams and gaps around my nose and the curves of my face. This extra wad of cheesecloth really covers that up. So, you might have a good tailor, or you're good at sewing. You can make a really good mask that's a penetration. If you're making them fast and furious, you might compensate with an insert into your mask. So that's the one idea I wanted to show. The second thing was I saw this sponge, and I thought, I wonder if this could filter things out, because if I were to breathe through from this side, how long would it take for the dust and virus to get all the way through if I'm sucking it in? Would it have filtration like this or like this? So I cut off a piece and can put it in there, and here's my cloth mask holder, and so that can work. And that's this sponge and 2-ply of cotton is about trying to breathe through 2-ply of this mask, and it's fairly comfortable. And I could wear it for a little bit. This could be have some confidence that this will filter out dust, at least. Now, if we read peer-reviewed papers about viruses and disinfection and how do we clean surfaces in hospitals and things, acids work very well to destroy virus. Vinegar is a very good acid, but bases seem to work a little better. And some very common sources of bases would be baking soda. Lime. If you pickle things, you're probably going to use pickling lime. Or if you're a farmer, you might have access to agricultural lime. Or you might be making lime with some small villages make lime all the time with bones and burning bones and things like that. I'm not exactly familiar with the process, but it's a very old school kind of technology that has been done around the world, and certainly is still being practiced in many villages. So if we took a baking soda or lime or something that was basic and we mix it with water, I can take the sponge and I can put it in that water, and I can squeeze out the water, and now I'll let that dry. Now my sponge will be impregnated with basic solutions. So if as I breathe through, the virus gets into the sponge, the moisture from my breath, the base will help disinfect it before it reaches my mouth. And you could do the same thing with the cheesecloth too. You could soak it, dry it, prepare it. Is one. Now there's another material that I worked with, and I'm going to use a little caution, but it is something worth noting. And these are coffee filters. A lot of survivalists, DIY people will sing praises about coffee filters. A lot of it's very overstated. Coffee filters are filter paper. They're not as good as lab grade filter paper. Lab grade filter paper should filter out 10 microns, which is what we want. And trying to breathe through that and trying to breathe through this, this is actually a little more tricky. But you can look up, if you hold it up to the light, you can see that it's more porous. It has some areas that are not so good, and it's also not as durable as as this. But it's not necessarily a bad filter. I mean, 2 plies of that is pretty close. Yeah, 2 ply of this is coming very close to trying to breathe through the N95. So yeah, it's approaching that level of micron thing, but the quality of control on off-the-shelf coffee filters, it's not going to be the same as a lab grade, and it's also much more fragile, you see. But this isn't necessarily something that isn't something you can still use. I could especially fill in the cup. I can actually add it to the breathing. We can augment it in other ways, and of course we can always take them and make like a cone, like they did in the Middle Ages, and have an area to breathe, and are using surface area to volume ratios. That can be very important. And I did try to experiment with some other materials. I've cut off just simple sponge material and Scotch-Brites, and they all seem to be able to have to be able to get certain similar comparative filtration from just the intuitive kind of test. Now, many of the people that I'm thinking about do live in coastal areas. I thought, well, there might be some old masks and snorkels. This is it's actually a pretty inexpensive mask that's made to look cool, but it's not really that high quality. If there are ones you can find or that have been discarded that could be converted, I thought that might be a good idea, and I put some filter paper and some material in here. And basically, it does work, but when I compared it to this 3M model, if I were to take this cartridge off and I cover this up and try to breathe through it, this, using the 3-dimension surface area to volume in the tube, to this one side, it breathes about the same, and it's not quite enough to be functional. So what 3M did, of course, is they just make another breathe port, and you have to buy 2 of them so you can have more airflow. So I think it's a mask and snorkel, if you can find one, with some filtration on it, could make a pretty good protection, especially if the snorkel went downward so that dust isn't falling on the top. It's going to be a little bit, the dust has to come up, and then you'd have to breathe it up so they'll have fewer dust, just how you physically use the apparatus, and then you can put some filtration in there for that. But I think that you would probably need to have 2 snorkels, 2 snorkel points and 2 filters on it for it to be practical. At least that's been my experiment. I encourage you to find your own. Now, the last thing I want to go through is, what do? I have some materials. I found some things. Oh, there are some other things that I think are interesting. The HEPA filters are used for like furnace filters. They're specifically to get dust, and dust of the size particles that we'd be worried about just walking around with Corvid. Vacuum cleaner bags also are to contain dust. Now, I've never actually been able to get them yet. That'll be my next thing, to see how well they work. And I don't know what kinds of materials you could find where you are. I mean, some places might have cocoa beans, and there's some thought that they could be ground up and put into like another one of these cones kind of thing, and have a lot of area for the viruses and the dust to land on. That could be a possibility. But I do want to caution you. Dust in your body, even without Corvid, can be very dangerous. Some dust particles your body isn't going to break down, or isn't going to break down very quickly, especially like wood dust. And asbestos, it will never break down. And fiberglass, it will never break down. So once you breathe in some dust and it gets into your system, your body's going to try to get rid of it, but it's just going to move back and forth and rip your cells apart. It'll cause cancer, it will destroy your cell, and it will never stop. So if you don't use an old dirty filter, you're going to basically, if you use like a mask that was filled with dust, or you could actually be breathing in something that will kill you just as well as the corvid. So dust is the enemy. Now, with that said, this mask, when I was a student, we used these all the time. And we didn't have any money, so we'd have one of them and we'd want to reuse them, and they'd be so filled with dust you could smell the dust. So, but there was a compressed air hose, and we would blast the compressed air, and all the dust would come out, and it would work fine. But I caution you to be very careful if you find materials that have filter in them with dust. If you can't be sure that your material is clean from dangerous dust particles, don't use it. Don't use it. You're just going to hurt yourself as badly as the corvid. So anyway, there was that. Now on to how do we preserve. So let's say we've gone through what's around us. We found some things that we can use for filtration for dust. We have an idea about how we want to fabricate masks. We understand about layering things and surface area to volume. But how do we renew it? I mean, one of the problems that we have in an inefficiency in large-scale industrial production is that we need an unlimited supply and an unlimited disposal. And we're not reusing things. Now, there's some efficiencies with that, but again, if I have to wait for 3M to make a whole new factory and bust out massive production and send it to the military and hospitals and places around the world, and it's going to be an inefficiency before human needs are met. How do we use these materials that we find and extend them? Well, here is one of the things that I'd like to share. This is that there's enough UV light in sunlight that can sterilize and kill viruses. Now, as a rule, it's been well established that between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn and at the equator, if you had like a 2-liter jar of water and you placed it in the sunlight under like aluminum foil or a piece of tin, there's enough UV to destroy the dangerous viruses to make it drinkable in at least minimum 6 hours. Most people would say 12. For me, I would like 24. And it can be cumulative as long as it's continuous. In my latitude where I live in the United States, I think it would take at least 24 hours. You have to double. Well, minimum would be 12. And 24 would be where I would feel kind of a moderate level of UV light. So this is kind of what I've been doing, is I could take one of these masks and I'll put it into the jar, and I keep a little bit of it off in the lid, and I can put that in direct sunlight, and let the I might want a better surface area on it. But one of the augmentations that we can do is then put some kind of disinfectant, rubbing alcohol, again, baking soda solution, vinegar. And as the sun comes down and it will evaporate the solvent, the mask will be surrounded by disinfecting fumes as well as UV light. So I would use the same rule of thumb. Minimum 6 hours at the equator, 12 hours in northern latitudes. And, you might want to double that to say, yeah, I got a good disinfection. You could do the same thing with your other types of filters. So we can basically process and repurpose these kinds of things. And also, this is effective too, because soap and water, you can launder this, and that would help the virus. What's also nice about this and the cloth is you can heat it too. That can destroy the viruses. Now, one of the things I'd like to, and also if you have like paper or something's disposable, you're using organic material, like you have tons of dead flowers and you're going to do what they did in the Middle Ages with a big long cone. Well, just remember that you have to throw that away eventually. and no known biologic will survive direct flame. So incinerate some things, you can clean some other things. I will caution you, however, if you try to use that with these masks. I've taken some samples to see how hot they can with how much heat can they withstand, and they start melting very, very quickly. They will melt below the boiling temperature of water, and in 100 and some, between 100 and 200 degrees in some cases. And so if you're at the equator, I mean, for where I live, it's no big deal. I could put it in here and stick it in the sun all day. It's very unlikely that it's going to melt. But if you're between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, you might not want to seal up one of your masks inside it. It could melt. But you might think about that same concept. If you can put it in the sun and it gets some good UV exposure, and I have some solvent somehow that can evaporate nearby, there's a good chance we can you can do the same thing without turning it into a little solar oven and destroying your material. However, like Scotch-Brite, some of these other things are a little bit more hardy. So there's another inefficiency that's in this material, that this is very good in terms of thinness and efficacy, but it doesn't last, and it's very hard to process it so you can use it again. These things we can launder. Now, one of the good things about the 3M mask is why did they replace the cloth masks, is because if I look through the medical textbooks in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they all have chapters on protocols on how to launder these masks. I have a couple of them in my my library here, and they start to disappear in the late 50s and 60s because and certainly in the 70s when some of these more better materials came out, they were not used the same. They were not used the same way as modern surgical masks. The old days, they would use the masks. Sometimes the doctors would have the masks changed several times in some certain surgeries. They would change their masks more frequently than with these. They were put into decontamination bags. They had whole laundered systems in the hospitals, specifically for the scrubs and for the masks. Well, this eliminated the entire laundry operation for surgical masks, and you didn't have to keep changing them, and you didn't have to do all that. So there's an efficiency that the material provided, eliminating all of this labor, which can be good. But now when we're threatened with the industrial level supply isn't there, that we've become dependent on, and the disposal system isn't there in some cases for some people, we have to go back to the cloth mask. And a lot of people are saying cloth versus this. Well, they seem like they're apples to apples, but they're not. They were never intended to be used exactly the same way. So that's something to bear in mind, that we can use filters for our masks and we can launder them. We need more care. We need more effort. There's some inefficiencies in that because we're more prone to human error and one person not being as careful as the next, and quality control can go down. But in terms of yourself, your neighbors, and small groups, small communities, small households, these problems can be solved by just determination and cooperation and being careful and committed to each other. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts about I wanted to share with you. I really do hope that I see some really great creative solutions, and please add to it. Keep researching, find out more stuff, share, prototype, because this is economics as if people matter, because we do. Stay safe, good luck, and God bless.